Well, welcome everyone to the 2 o'clock Eastern session. We are at Crisis as a Constant, Understanding the Communicative Enactment of Communities of Practice within the Extension Disaster Education Network. I am Abby Lopop. I'm the National Eden Project Director based at Purdue University in Indiana. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for this session. We have Danielle Farley. She's a social scientist with a BS, a BA, and an MA in communication studies from the University of Montana. Her scholarly interests involve risk and crisis communication and knowledge management, specifically in the context of ag production and food systems. Joel Iverson is a professor of communication studies at University of Montana, and his scholarly interests focus on theory of development of enacting organizations through communicative constitution of organizations from a structure and approach using the 4 flows model of communication. He applies this approach in several areas, including organizational knowledge, nonprofit organizations, risk communication, and crisis communication. Specifically, he examines organizational knowledge through communities of practice, theory, and a variety of contexts, including earthquake forecasting, health support groups, volunteer management, and nonprofit organizations. Joel has 20+ publications and has worked with the ABD-CAP grant funded through USDA NIFA and currently holds a joint voluntary agreement to work with the U.S. Forest Service regarding wildland firefighting, organizational change, and COVID-19. I have submitted the evaluation link in the chat pod. I'll go ahead and post it again towards the end, so I will ask for you to follow up with those at the end of the session, but I'm going to turn it over to Danielle and Joel.
All right, well, thank you very much. It's great to be back. This is really, I guess, thank you for a couple of things. A year ago, you welcomed us with open arms to Eden as a conference after May of 2019, when we were part of a grant project that was using communities of practice to understand biosecurity in animal systems. Danielle and I are at the University of Montana. We've made the drive to Spokane, spent time at Eden, as well as Danielle conducted a lot of interviews, and we're going to, and this was her master's thesis project as well as part of a larger grant. I guess if we go to the next slide, we can do the disclaimer part. So yeah, we showed up to Eden last year and got to know about Eden from that May conference in DC. Several Eden members said, well, if you're studying communities of practice, you have to study Eden. And we were, as part of this large animal disease biosecurity coordinated agricultural project, which is being run by Dr. Julie Smith. We're in our no-cost extension year of this. So this is one of our last major projects, was to look at Eden as an example. So there's our USD NIFA disclaimer that what we're saying doesn't represent what they're saying, okay? So we're going to look at the background, a little bit of communities of practice and some of the theory, and then Danielle's going to talk about her methods, the results, and the discussion that she found. And we'd like to leave a little bit of time to use this as a little bit of a member check back, since a lot of you were very willing participants in this project, and to just talk about Eden and where that goes. So this is our invitation to you to have a moment to talk about yourselves. So. As we look at at why Eden, as I said before, we're looking at this whole collective response to things like porcine epidemic diarrhea virus, and how do we help people prepare good biosecurity practices for things like African swine fever, high pathogenic avian influenza, and other diseases from a human perspective. And how do we get humans to engage in better biosecurity practices? Much like, in that last session, how do we get people to engage in better preparedness for other kinds of disaster? And Eden is a really good exemplar of a long-standing community of practice, right? Situated within extension, you know all of this better than we do. You bridge local, state, and national networks. And we just think you're generally an interesting group that is active in knowledge sharing. And I think the enthusiasm that you all have for Eden really was contagious to us when we showed up to Spokane. You even let me win in a board game at the conference last year, so that was all very exciting work. So when we think about communities of practice and we think about practices, it takes a real specific approach to understanding how do people learn, how do people gain knowledge, and how do people put that into practice? And so when we think about that, we really look at, instead of looking at knowledge as information, we look at it as knowing and doing as intertwined activities. And within the idea of practice, there are really two elements. One is the participation element, which is the action, actually doing things, engaging with one another, talking to one another, building the Eden network. And then the reifications are the things that have permanence. And I would include things like relationships, fact sheets, know-who networks, and a lot of other permanent parts to that idea of practice. So if you think about those two working together, how you participate, what are some of the tangible outcomes that come out of that, and then how do people draw on those to continue participation? It really helps us understand what a communication approach to communities of practice is, right? That we learn to do and keep doing knowledge accomplishing activities, not that knowledge is just something that's cognitive and in our brains. That's our general approach. And so communities of practice are a social grouping that engage in knowledge sharing practices and inform and sustain that through a common interest. That's a lot of the earlier research. And we've decided to really start taking the elements of that as a lens to understand different groups. And it says my internet's unstable. Am I still going okay? Okay. So COP theory then becomes a lens to help us understand different groups. And I've looked at a lot of different groups in my research, from earthquake forecasters to groups who are docents at a botanical garden to disaster response volunteers for large agencies. And all of them are different. And you learn more about how the community of practice is working, how it's successful or unsuccessful, where it could maybe improve. And those are the three elements: mutual engagement, how do you interact with one another, as well as how do you negotiate that joint enterprise. And that's really like how you collectively navigate the ship that is Eden. How do you set common goals? What does Eden mean to you? How do you engage in Eden? And the final thing is shared repertoire. What comes out of that? Common language, common resources, specialized knowledge. Stories was a huge one, which Danielle will get to in a moment. And it really helps us think about, what does Eden provide as an exemplar to look at when you're trying to get other groups or collections of people who are geographically dispersed to engage in a common activity or a common goal. So why don't you take over, Danielle, and take us into your thesis.
So along with communities of practice theory, we also use the three-stage model of crisis development to understand how Eden, how you all communicate and share knowledge and create knowledge together during the pre-crisis, crisis, and post-crisis stage of crisis development. So from the incubation before crisis happens to the onset or a specific triggering event of a crisis, and then of course in the post-crisis stage where you're making sense of what happened and thinking about things to prepare for the future. And so we used this model along with communities practice to understand what it is that makes you successful and how you engage throughout these stages. And that leads me to the research questions that I asked. The first, how does mutual engagement allow Eden members to meet their organizational mission? Research question 2, how do Eden members negotiate a joint enterprise? And research question 3, how do Eden members develop a shared repertoire? The methods I used qualitative research methods. This involved semi-structured interviews with 13 participants, and interview times ranged between 26 minutes and 2.5 hours. And this translated into 190 pages of single-space transcripts. I also used participant observation in my methods. I took field notes and considered 25 hours at the annual Eden conference last year in Spokane, Washington as my participant observation. And this reflected to being about 18 pages of single-spaced field notes. For the analysis, I used a software tool called Temi, and that essentially transcribes recordings of interviews or recordings of anything. And then from there, I coded all of the interviews for mutual engagement, negotiation of a joint enterprise, and shared repertoires. That leads us to our findings. So for research question 1, how does mutual engagement allow Eden members to meet their organizational mission? I found three main things for mutual engagement, and that was information seeking, resource sharing behaviors, collaboration, and informal relationship building. So information seeking and resource sharing, this is probably not new to any of you. This is, almost why Eden exists. Members gain access to knowledge to help solve localized problems within their own state and region by interacting with each other and sharing the information they have or tangible resources that they have. And some of these examples, and maybe these are stories about snake boards or specifically a continuation of operation plans that different states in different regions that experience vastly different disasters have used together through post-crisis and pre-crisis reflections. And then another example is the Red River Valley floods, and actually sharing written material about sandbagging during the crisis stage. And then collaboration, again, this is probably not new to you, but we found 2 types of collaboration, and I call them singular and dual focused. So a singular collaboration would be when one person is in a crisis and other people help for the main goal of helping that one individual. And then a dual purpose collaboration is when people collaborate for the same type of goal. For example, Eden members collaborating to mitigate the potential of African swine fever by, coming up with written plans to help mitigate that if there ever was an outbreak, and working with, regional borders. And here we see a really great story, one of my favorites about collaboration. If you need a resource, they'll find it. Steve, Eden chair from a Midwestern university, called one night when power outages and tornadoes hit southern Mississippi and said, "We gotta help Rob. He's got 5 towns with no communication. We knew people that were with the communications industry, so we called them." The next day, about 2 in the afternoon, this guy comes up to Rob's office in Mississippi and says he has 2 semis with 16 cellular standalone systems delivered from Colorado. So Rob took them over to the 5 communities and put them at fire stations and courthouses. And instantly those towns had emergency communication. That's Eden. The third type of mutual engagement that we found is informal relationship building. And really this is creating the spaces at your annual meeting, like the welcome reception, the game night, the happy hour, all of the meals, breakfast and lunch and the different breaks. People are building these informal relationships. They're getting to know who is part of the network. So when they do need to call upon people for resources or for collaboration, they know who these people are. And here we have a quote from somebody who really values this part of the informal relationship building. And having that network of people is super important. I know it's expensive and it's hard to get people to pay for everyone to come together and meet. But I think at the end of the day, you actually end up saving money because you're actually making that connection. We know who to talk to, you know who to connect with, you know them personally, and you've seen their face. And across the board in all 13 of the interviews and also during the participant observation, this was really shown as a value to Eden members and an important part of the meeting and the success, the overall success. That leads us to research question 2. How do Eden members negotiate a joint enterprise? And in the literature for communities of practice theory, it really suggests that the common goal or joint enterprise is in constant negotiation. And what we found with Eden, with you all, is that the joint enterprise is steadfast. The central common goal is what drives your efforts together, and that you negotiate this joint enterprise formally. So instead of this being something that's wavering or changing or in constant motion, we think that this is part of why Eden is long-standing and strong and focused, because you are all centered around the common goal of providing research-based education to prevent, respond, and recover from crises and natural disasters. So on to research question 3. How do Eden members develop a shared repertoire? We found 2 main themes. The first one is common phrases that were used. No need to recreate the wheel. And there is a lot that I do not know. And then the second thing is storytelling. So first for the phrases. No need to recreate the wheel. Here I provide 2 examples of questions that I asked and responses that I got. And this was reoccurring. Many people use this phrase. And so here we see, I asked, what do you try to accomplish within Eden? So there's gaps of information that we have. I try to build a relationship here at the annual meeting so that I can build a network with individuals that already have that information that we might be needing and not have to reinvent the wheel. Another question I posed was, what do you value about Eden? Well, Eden is where this information is already available. You don't really have to reinvent the wheel. So when a disaster strikes, you just get on the website or get on the listserv, send some information out, and you have instant information and replies on whatever your needs are. And really, the use of this phrase suggests that people value not having to create new material from scratch. It also values the diverse expertise of Eden members and knowing that there's probably somebody out there who knows maybe a little bit more than you and already has done this. So reach out to them, see what resources they have, and really making your life a lot easier. The second phrase, I've learned there's a lot I do not know. And this was, mainly a response from the question I asked of, what have you learned from being a part of Eden? And this type of response suggests that Eden members are mobilizing the diverse expertise within the network. And it emphasizes the importance of support and collaboration with Eden members throughout the country in crisis response. The next type of shared repertoire that we found was the act of telling stories. And what we can tell from these interviews and from our participant observation is that Eden is a storytelling organization and that these stories serve as a purpose. They're a sense-making tool of how Eden responds to crises through collaboration. So often these are stories of success, sometimes stories of a struggle that ended up as a success by reaching out to somebody and collaborating. And the use of these stories indicate a learned behavior of telling and retelling stories. So I'll go ahead and tell you a story. Last year at the welcome reception, Joel and I were there. We were gathering and meeting with many people, and I would introduce my research and my thesis and what my work was. And people would start to tell me a story. And it often wasn't their own story. It was a story from somebody else. And so from there, they would tell me the story, then they'd walk me over and introduce me to another person. And so this storytelling was vast. It was happening with everybody that I interviewed, and it was constant, and it kind of acted as an informal, unofficial snowball sampling. So, one person tells me a story, they walk me over to another person. And here you even see a quote from a participant explaining what the stories are about and why they enjoy going to the annual meeting, because you hear good stories you don't typically hear. And when you start hearing it from across the nation and see how these problems are solved by people that are doing the same boots on the ground work as you, it's encouragement to keep doing it, to keep being involved in the network. And outside of the 3 main elements of communities of practice theory, I found something interesting that was happening between Eden members, and that is social support. I found that people were offering social support and reporting that they felt like they were receiving social support from other Eden members when they were experiencing a crisis. And this goes beyond just knowledge sharing and knowledge creation. And this really gets at the social relationships that are formed and kind of what else Eden is doing that makes them unique. And social support involves an individual's perceptions of availability of support, actual support messages received, and the frequency of that type of interaction, and how they feel as a result from receiving those messages. So I'm not going to read this entire quote that you see, but this is really a story about somebody reflecting on when they were reaching out to an individual who was in crisis and had extreme floods. And they just said, hey, I'm thinking of you. Do you need anything? Can I send you anything via text? Because they knew they didn't have internet connection. And the person responded, well, I'm surrounded by water right now. I can't go anywhere or do anything. And the reflection is just being able to talk to someone who knows what it's like to be in this role is kind of a mental health help. And so this was a very interesting finding that we found. So now I'd like to go into sharing some of these insights as suggestions for, you could take this as thinking about Eden and how you are a strong network, how you are a strong community of practice, but also potentially how you might reflect on how Eden is successful in creating these knowledge sharing practices that you might want to try to recreate within your own local community and with the stakeholders that you're involved with there. So communities of practice, in practice, cultivating meaningful engagement. So one of the main things that we see as really important is creating those informal relationships and creating those spaces to build those informal relationships. And what this does is it establishes a know who versus know what network, and a know who network compared to know what network really says that the contacts that you have kind of expand your ability to reach expertise versus having a know what network where you just know what you know and potentially know what other people know. So members learn the meaning of active participation in Eden through these informal places, like the game night, like the happy hour. At the welcome reception, people who are new to the organization get a feeling for what it means to be an Eden member, and part of that is enthusiastically, offering assistance and asking for assistance without hesitation. And so we think that those types of behaviors are learned through the informal relationship building process. And building this social part of your organization allows for collaboration and information sharing to flow. And through these casual encounters, it leads to innovation and collaboration. And one of my favorite quotes that really gets at a know who versus know what network is, the big thing is, if I ever get a tsunami in the middle of Wyoming, I know 5 people that I can call and say, how do I deal with this? So communities of practice and cultivating meaningful engagement through social support. So social support has 4 main functions, and this is a bit tied to how you can also cultivate meaningful mutual engagement through emotional, informational, tangible, and belonging support. And so these are actions that you can engage in and intentionally create within your network. Emotional support, helping someone feel better about an upsetting or stressful situation. Informational support, giving advice or guidance to an individual experiencing a life stressor or responding to a disaster or a crisis. This is what I've done in the past, this is what's worked well. Tangible support would be the material exchange of time, resources, or assistance. So think about any of the fact sheets or handouts. Many of the ones that we heard from were co-op plans and, like sandbagging, how to deal with mold after a flood, things like that. Those are all considered tangible forms of offering of social support. And then lastly, belonging support is creating affiliation and connection to others through a shared activity. So that happens often through collaboration. and working together on specific projects. And, you know, communities of practice, in practice, how can you maintain cohesiveness? And one thing that you all do very well is have a clear and common goal that supports your purpose. And then also developing shared repertoires. First, just so people have a general understanding of how we talk about things, how we communicate. We've seen this even this week in the conference of, you know, knowing who has specific roles when you show up at a crisis or disaster event, and knowing those roles involves knowing the language surrounded with those responsibilities. And then participating in reflection through stories. You know, this seems like a very natural thing that happens within your network, but you know, you could prompt it in meaningful ways as people are reflecting on what has happened and thinking about lessons learned for success in moving forward. And let's see, communities of practice and crisis communication in practice. So really, if you think about the three stages of crisis development, and as we have seen what Eden is very strong at and what you can think about intentionally moving forward is developing pre-established relationships before a crisis or a disaster, and doing that through having common language, having a common goal, and creating that know-who network. Who do you need to be working with? Who can you reach out to? And who needs the information when a disaster or crisis strikes? And then afterwards, in the post-crisis stage, make sense of what happened. And within the Eden network and within your local community, like reflect on the stories and engage in the storytelling, because it is really a profound way that humans make sense of things, especially traumas that have happened. And this can help strengthen stakeholder relationships if you're participating in this together. Another quote that I really appreciated was that, you know, even though all disasters are very different, some of those foundations, especially some of those proactive steps that you can take, are the same. And Joel, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, so as we think about the project and the findings that you know, that we had from that, and Danielle for her thesis, she did a great job. A lot of really good work in doing the interviews and analyzing the data. You know, understanding Eden, I think, really provides an opportunity for Eden to self-reflect on what it does well, and maybe it gives some language to some of those things that you intuitively know about Eden. But it also works really well to think of things like, for example, if the Port Council and veterinarians and other groups that aren't as connected as Eden want to get to a point where they're better off with their pre-crisis planning, when they're in a crisis, what are the things that matter to take themselves through post-crisis and getting ready for the next one. You know, in looking back at the porcine epidemic diarrhea virus outbreak, for example, and then how can you take those ideas and go forward into planning for African swine fever or something else that may come up that we didn't know about, really is helpful and useful to look at, not just that it is successful, but part of why it's successful, and how, you know, some of the things that outsiders might see as unnecessary, like why does Eden have to get together every year? Don't you know each other already and have that disaster? I think what our findings helps give explanation and justification for why that can happen. So what we want to do is, yeah, now go to that next slide, is open it up to you to ask, does this make sense? Does this ring true with what you know for Eden? And, you know, what are some of the things that you can use as maybe some senior members of Eden start stepping away and there's a next generation of Eden members? You know, how can that pass along? Or we're just kind of curious what your reactions are and thoughts. So thank you once again.
I think we should hear from Becky and what your thoughts are, Becky.
I had the same thought.
Oh, put me on the spot, you guys. You just saw senior member and thought of me.
But I think it's important for Joel and Danielle to know that Becky is our last a charter member of Eden. She was there from the time it became Eden till now. So I think her thoughts are really valuable.
Absolutely.
I appreciated visiting with Danielle and Joel last year. And this may sound a little snotty, but from the very beginning, I think what makes Eden successful partly is how it's so grassroots and not top down. It wasn't nobody from NIFA is on, right? It wasn't NIFA saying you should do this, but it was so grassroots. Just in case some of you who are on don't know, after the 93, I'm sorry, Mississippi and Missouri floods, Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri got what was then CSR EES grant to bring together the North Central region states to just talk about, we learned so much, how can we capture what Extension did and not have to reinvent the wheel when other states have something like that happen. And little did I know our river would flood in '97. So this was before we had a website, I kept emailing Baker, help, what do we do? What do you have? And that personal connection that was truly grassroots, I think, is what continues to make Eden so successful. Also, the diversity of membership. Most of us are in our community development professional organization or our ag organization, or me, I'm in our communications professional organization. But this one, what I so enjoy is the diversity. And you can talk to a forester or a 4-H person, or, we've got pretty much everybody in Extension represented. And that brings such strength to the organization. I don't want to call us an organization.
The network.
Brings such strength to the network. Yes, I about slipped.
For the person who always corrects it for us.
That's right. I'm the one who corrects everybody.
You're getting close to the end, Becky. I was going to chime in and say that, and it was said earlier this week that we are a network of 400 people that have egos to go with it, because we are 400 people that are nationally recognized for what we're really good at. But those egos are all at the door. You have 400 people who have really let proprietorship of anything that we create for ourselves go. If somebody else is in need, it's a unified team. And often I refer to Eden as more like a family than an organization or a network. That for 400, we're still really close. You can see it how we interact, where we're not always, tip-top professional, because we know each other. We've met each other's spouses and kids, and as of the last 6 months, pets and dogs. And so we really get to know each other. And but that's what creates these tight bonds, and where I have no problem emailing or texting somebody when I need something, saying, I know, even if you aren't the person that has this answer, you know the person that I need. Give me a shout out, help hook me up. But when you have access to 400 people who are the best at what they do, you're only made stronger and you look better in your own backyard.
Absolutely. So how do you think you create that when, say, a new person comes in? How do they learn that?
We adopt them. We're a big family that has this underlying adoption program. And I think we formalized it last year with our new attendee reception. But we love to share the wealth. And bringing new people on board, whether it's from our institutions or other institutions, I think it's, number one, it's important because some of us, are not getting any younger. And it's important because the work is important. And I think that's the thing that makes this so valuable. And everybody, as Abby said and as Becky said, we are willing to share and we want it to go on. When we retire, we're going to go, camp out on Becky's door in Tucson. But you know, I think it's that value that you say, this is important beyond us and now. This is something that goes a long way. And so it's important to get other people engaged and excited.
And this is going to sound kind of weird, but what I like about Eden is there's no competition. You think about our other professional organizations, or I'm not sure with all of them, but like in communications and ACE, I'll admit, I go, damn, Auburn beat us again in that category, you know, because there's a contest. And in Eden, we're not competitive. We're truly, as you pointed out, collaborative. There's no competition at all. And in a lot of our organizations, that's not the case. We're truly here to help each other. And some of us aren't very shy, right, Carrie and Abby? We just go up to people at receptions that we don't know and say, hey, Joyce McGarry told the story just 2 days ago it was, that she met me when we were on the van from the airport to the hotel together, and she had on her Michigan State shirt, and I'm not shy. I said, hi, are you heading to Eden? And we hit it off immediately. So in this kind of work, you got to be a little bit of assertive, and so that's why we all just welcome new members with open arms.
This is Ashley from Nebraska. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Mhm.
Hey,
Okay, good. So hello. Thank you for sharing, Danielle. It's good to see you again. One of the things I was going to add too, I guess, in response to your question is, so some of you know that I'm working towards my PhD right now, and the topic that I'm studying is informal mentoring and how it happens in an extension context. And so I think there's this phenomenon that we can observe within Eden as well of informal mentoring, this relational aspect, so it goes back to, right, these social opportunities that Eden affords us when we're all together to really find people that we're compatible with. We share interests, right? It's this relation building. And so anyway, I was just going to add that I think that is what is so great about the network is that it really kind of taps into, the relationship aspect here. And I just think about all of the folks that are on this call and not, that I tap into when I have a question, right, regarding how to approach something here in Nebraska as it relates to disasters. There's so much knowledge, and I've always felt like with this relational mentoring that Eden provides, there is no hierarchy. It's we're coming together as peers to help each other out. So just was going to add that.
That's great. Yeah. On this page, you can see a link, and that would take you to the full thesis, where really expands upon that informal relationship building aspect of Eden, what makes it unique and really successful, if that interests you. But I'm glad that your research is going that way, Ashley, and it's really good to hear from you again.
Well, it's so exciting, Danielle, to see your work come to fruition, and just so appreciate the opportunity to hear, from the finality standpoint. It feels good to get the thesis done, but to see, right, all of your hard work here and to be able to share that with us. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here's another example of how we're all on such a level playing field. On an earlier session, when Lindsay kept referring to Dr. Place, and I'd have to go, oh yeah, Nick, because when we're together, it's not Dr. this and Dr. that. We're on a truly first name basis. And last year I had to keep remembering, oh yeah, Mike Gaffney, he's like the extension director. But everybody was so down to earth that there's no hierarchy at all.
Right. Danielle, this is Reagan Adams. Good to see you again. And I agree, it's great to see your work tightened up and finished up. I'd like to add the word that I love about Eden is the humility that each of the Eden members bring. And I think that has something to do with what we focus on. We focus on when incidences in which everything is lost, or everything, and we have to build from anew, and one better leave their ego somewhere else and concentrate on the humility of sharing and just being together and starting from scratch. And that happens with every conversation. I think every time you start with somebody, it's like we're on the same ground and we're sort of feel like we're on a desert island and the boat just broke left. And it really changes the conversations.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I would absolutely agree. And I think it's great to be able to reflect on that from the inside. And it's interesting. So how would you feel, or how would you say this? Like, everyone is in their own academic area, still in their own institution, but when you come to Eden, the competition is left at the door and humility and collaboration all takes place. I'm just curious if anyone has any more insights or wants to talk about that process.
I think it has to do with the fact, this is Reagan again, the fact on what we're focusing on. We're focusing on disasters. So everything's gone, the structure, the hierarchy, except for, say, you know, the incident command system and everything. So you bring that, what's it like when nobody, you know, when there isn't the hierarchy there, when that's left. Actually, I can tell you I'm a veterinarian and we always talk about our war stories too. So whenever you get a bunch of veterinarians together, they're usually pretty humble as well, because they try to save lives, but they've all lost lives. Mm-hmm. And so you oftentimes are not, you don't think you're that big of yourself.
Right. Narratives are such a good way to share. Oh, sorry. Narratives are such a good way to share complex information as well as attitude. You know, there's a lot you can fit into a story that people can process. And so, yeah, that's very true. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, it's kind of just in that grand spectrum of, well, one, I always say that anybody that deals in the disaster world, we all have slightly warped sense of humor anyhow, because you have to take it all with a grain of salt. Because when we're really in that response recovery phase, I mean, some of us get to work a lot on that planning and mitigation, but when you're in the response and recovery phases, it's not pretty. And for the most part, knock on wood, it doesn't typically affect us at home. It might on occasion, and then that's when we really all pitch in and we're like, okay, how can we help? But for the most part, when people are seeing us doing the response and recovery portions of our job, we're seeing them on their best day. So we're there to be a resource for those individuals and those communities. So my pride and ego needs to take, you know, those 10 steps back, because it doesn't matter how I feel at the end of the day. It's our job to be helping others kind of reach whatever that new normal is and get them put back together. So it's continually having that almost a pay it forward aspect. And so if we can all come together to do that, we're better serving our communities and our stakeholders, because that's who it impacts at the end of the day.
Yeah, a clear mission really helps direct that focus, right? Like for me, it all started with the 97 flood in Fargo as well, because I was at NDSU at that time. So hearing Becky talk about that always connects that back for me. And, you know, it's great to see this network. And I really do think that it works well as an example for others, in part because it is organic. It happened on its own out of a need. There's a clear mission that people focused on, but also, I mean, you had a choice about how you could enact this, right? You could enact Eden as a very structured, rigid, there's a test before, you know, there's a litmus test before we can share one of your resources you've developed. We'll go through a critical review. You know, you chose to make this a friendly organization because it's better for you. But that, you know, that's a conscious choice, right? Not every organization is like that. And I think that's something to celebrate.
All right, well, we do have about 1 minute left before we have that transition period to our capstone speaker. So I'll leave it with if there's either one final question or any final comments from Danielle or Joel. I have put the evaluation link back in the chat, so if all of you could go ahead and complete that for us, we greatly appreciate it. But
I would just like to say thank you for all of you who are in this session, who participated in the research. It was a pleasure interviewing you, and I really enjoyed writing this, and it's really great to be reporting back. In the chat, I included a link if anyone is brave and interested in reading in more detail what this research involves. you can find a link to the thesis there. So thank you so much. And I would love to see you all in person next year.
Fantastic. We look forward to it.
Thank you, Danielle.
You're welcome. Absolutely. My pleasure.
Standing invitation to attend the Eden annual meeting, and you can follow us for your entire career.
That sounds good. Yes.
Well, thanks everybody.
Thank
And
you.
thanks to Lisa and Julie Smith who let us do this project. So that's great. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Julie, as well.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we'll see you all in the capstone. Thank you for being here.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.